It was early when I found the note. I was in my dressing gown, walking through the lounge on my way to get some cereal, when I saw it. A scruffy yellow post-it, lying on the mat by the front door. Morning sunlight streamed through the window and framed it in a golden rectangle. Before I'd even read the message, I could tell by the messy handwriting that it was from Toby. "Jamie, come to the old sawmill as soon as you get this. It's urgent. Toby." I read the note twice, then stuffed it in my pocket, and frowned. Toby's my best friend in our village, and we see each other almost every day, school and at weekends. But he was never normally up this early, and he'd never left me a note before. Normally, on the rare occasions he was up before me, I'd wake to the sound of him throwing stones at my bedroom window from the garden. I'd part the curtains, and there he'd be, a curly-haired teenager with a big grin on his face, squinting at me through the morning sunlight. But this was new. It wasn't like Toby either. I paused for a moment, listening. The house was silent around me. It was a Saturday, which meant Mum and Dad were still upstairs asleep, lying in. Normally I'd have a line too, but I'd woken, sweating from a nightmare I could no longer remember. Hadn't been able to get back to sleep. So now, here I was. My hair was a mess, and my eyes still crusted, staring down at the note, feeling a worm of anxiety in my stomach that I couldn't place. I left the house 15 minutes later, skipped breakfast in the end. I tried Toby's mobile a couple of times first, but when it kept going to voicemail, my impatience got the better of me. I chucked on some clothes and left through the front door, closing it quietly behind me. If Mum or Dad woke up, they wouldn't care that I was off out so early, but they would want to know where I was going. Then I'd have to explain the note, and it'd be a whole thing. Much easier to slip away unnoticed. Winter sunlight made me squint as I made my way down the drive. My footsteps crunched over gravel. I creaked the front gate open, wincing at the sound it made, and as I reached the main village road, I glanced instinctively to my right, in the direction of Toby's house. I frowned. Toby's house is a little way down from mine, on the opposite side of the road, an old brick cottage like ours. Normally, when I look down there, I can see two cars parked outside, Toby's dad's Land Rover and his mum's Peugeot. But today, there were 3 vehicles, and the third was a police car. "What do you reckon that's about then?" The voice made me jump. I spun around and saw our next door neighbour, Mr. Willows, leaning over his fence, watching me. Mr. Willows is a bit odd, but he's okay. He's this old guy who lives on his own and spends most of his time out in the garden, smoking. Always wears a suit. Today he had a black blazer and a pink tie on, as though he was off to a wedding. His grey hair spilled over his forehead, which was wrinkled into a frown as he stared at me. I stared back as he stretched out his hand and thumbed the end of his cigarette, sprinkling ash onto the tarmac. I opened my mouth to say something, but Mr. Willows spoke again before I could. "You're up early, Jamie. You have to find your mate?" "Yeah, I'm going to meet him now. You didn't see him earlier, did you?" Mr. Willows was taking another drag on his cigarette, but now he broke off, coughing. He held it away from his face and stared at it, his frown deepening into a scowl. "Last time I buy this crap. They were out of my brand at the co-op, but I'd rather go without a smoke than this crap." He flicked the cigarette. I watched it sail from his hand and land on the road. The glowing tip trailed smoke through the air. "Nah, I haven't seen your friend in a while. You have to call him now, are you?" "No, I'm going to meet him nearby. He left a note for me this morning." Mr. Willows had been half turned away from me, as if he was getting ready to go inside. But now he paused and looked back. The flicker of some emotion I couldn't place passed behind his eyes. "Left you a note, did he?" "Yeah, I'd better go find out what he wants. I normally didn't mind talking to Mr. Willows, but this conversation was starting to drag. I began walking down the road to the left, past Mr. Willow's fence, in the direction of the little footpath that would lead me to the old sawmill. But as I drew level with the place he was standing, I felt his eyes on me again. I turned towards him and forced a smile onto my face. "I'll see you later, Mr. Willows. Have a good day." For a second, that same emotion I'd seen before, something almost like confusion, passed the old man's face. But a moment after that, it was gone again. He nodded and tipped me a wave. Old bugger's probably losing it, I thought to myself as I continued down the road. I glanced back once when I was halfway to the gate that would lead me to the footpath. Mr. Willows still hadn't gone back inside. He was standing in the same place by the fence, fiddling with the lapel of his blazer, staring at me. The old sawmill. Why the hell did Toby want to meet there? As I hurried along the footpath, green light flickering through the tall hedgerows on either side of me, I racked my brain. The thing was, we'd already explored the sawmill to death. We'd done it a couple of years back. The place had been a great find at first, a dilapidated old barn that looked like something from a horror film. A ruined building which sat in the middle of a wooded clearing, smack bang between two fields. It was spooky and remote, and we'd had a great time climbing the rafters and exploring every dark corner there was to explore. But that had all been several years ago. We were older now. We'd already done the sawmill to death. As I reached a little stream that bisected the footpath, I glanced up at the sky. Thick, black clouds were gathering overhead. I wasn't far from the sawmill now, and it looked like that might be a good thing. Rain was coming. "Toby? Toby?" My voice echoed in the silence of the clearing. I shivered. The rain clouds were directly overhead now, blocking out the sunlight, turning the clearing into a patchwork quilt of greys and dark greens. The sawmill reared up in front of me, all splintered rafters and chipped brick. An old red door was set into the side of the building, the paint pink faded and flaking off in chunks. Nobody had used it in years though, and that included me and Toby. We didn't need to. The entire front end of the building was missing, gaping open like a wound, exposed to the elements. From where I was standing, I could just see inside. Dusty concrete, old wood, and a scattering of rusted, bramble-chocked tools. No sign of Toby anywhere. "Toby, where are you, mate?" I took a few steps forwards, towards the open end of the building. Shivered again. Wind rushed through the trees at the edge of the clearing, making the leaves whisper. I stared at the shadows inside the sawmill and felt that worm of anxiety in my stomach again. Those shadows looked too dense somehow. It was like peering into a cave. Was it possible Toby was hiding somewhere in there, crouched in the darkness, waiting to jump out at me? It wouldn't have been entirely out of character. But then again what? Why are you acting like some scared little child? As the thought was running through my head, I felt the first drop of rain on my skin. That did it. I shoved my nerves to one side and strode forwards, covered the remaining distance between myself and the sawmill in a few quick steps. When I'd reached the ruined opening of the building, I paused again, peering into the shadows. "Toby, you in there?" I took another step. "Toby, this isn't funny, mate. If this is all some kind of wind-up and you got me out here for nothing, I'm not going to be happy." I took another step and felt my foot crunch broken glass. The sound made me wince. All around the clearing, the wind suddenly picked up. Tree branches crashed against each other. Leaves shook. The rain began to fall more steadily, the droplets hitting the clearing in a constant patter. I took another step forwards, The shadows were all around me now. The inside of the sawmill smelled like dust and mould. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, intending to use the little torch function, but as I was pulling it out, I caught a shape from the corner of my eye. I looked to my left and bit back a scream. Toby stood in the shadows. He was over by the left-hand wall of the sawmill, standing with his back to the brick, facing me. I couldn't see his features in the gloom, but I could just make out his thick mop of hair. Jesus Christ, Toby! I could feel my heartbeat hammering in my chest. My skin, which had been cold a moment ago, suddenly felt too hot. You scared the hell out of me. Toby stood against the wall, unmoving. What the hell are you doing out here? Is this a wind-up? Toby didn't say anything. Toby, what the hell, mate? This isn't funny. Toby still didn't speak. Instead, he slowly lifted his left arm, held it out away from his body, pointing. I followed his finger. There was something in the shadows, near where Toby stood, lying coiled in the darkness next to a pile of bricks. What the hell? Toby didn't say anything, just kept pointing. Rain pounded down harder outside the sawmill. The wind howled. I had my phone out of my pocket now, and I thumbed on the little torch. The light spilled out and lit up the shadowy floor. A green tie. That's what Toby was pointing at. It lay coiled next to the bricks in a little heap on the concrete floor. I stepped closer. Toby, what? But I stopped talking when I got a better look at it. When I saw what was on it, I bent down and picked up the tie. It would have looked shiny and new if it wasn't for the rust-coloured blotches darkening the green, the messy, browning stains that covered it. Those marks weren't just on the tie either, I saw now. The floor below me had been stained the same colour. There were patches of the stuff all over the dusty concrete. They looked like... Toby, what the hell is this? I moved the torch away from the stains and flashed it at the spot Toby had been standing, and my light struck dusty brick. I felt fear and confusion surge through me in a wave. Toby was gone. Toby? Toby! The wind drowned out my cries. It roared around the old sawmill, making the wooden beams creak. Rain hammered down outside. Rain. And something else. A sound I could only just make out, half muffled as it was beneath the crash of raindrops. The steady, pounding thump of footsteps. Toby? Toby! I moved towards the entrance of the sawmill, still holding the stained tie in one hand. There was no sign of Toby anywhere. I looked out at the rain, hammering through the clearing in thick sheets. Wind buffeted the half-obscure tree line. The sawmill creaked and groaned. I turned to my left, squinting my eyes as I scanned the clearing, and then I heard the footsteps again. They were over to my right, growing louder as they pounded closer and closer to the sawmill. I turned in their direction, my mouth open to yell for Toby, but the shout died in my throat as a figure emerged from the rain. Mr. Willows, still wearing the suit he'd been in earlier, only now the thing looked wrecked. His pink tie was skewed, his soaked shirt sticking to his chest. His grey hair was sodden, plastered to the skin of his forehead in dark strands. His eyes were wide in his face. He'd been running, one hand pressed to his chest, but as soon as he saw me, he slowed down. He came to a stop just inside the shelter of the sawmill, a few feet away from me, put his hands on his knees and pulled in deep breaths. Mr. Willows? Mr. Willows, what happened? Are you okay? I stuffed my phone in my pocket and hurried over to him, putting my free hand on his shoulder. My mind was whirling with questions, but I couldn't think which to ask first. Fear swirled in my stomach, fueled by the only explanation I could think of for Mr. Willow's sudden arrival. Either something had happened to my parents, or something had happened to Toby's. Mr. Willow seen me heading in this direction and followed me. That had to be it. He'd come to tell us. My mind conjured an image of the police car I'd seen outside of Toby's house earlier, and I bit my lip. Mr. Willows, what's happened? Is everyone okay? After a few more seconds, Mr. Willows reached up and put his hand on my shoulder for support. Stood up straight. His face was red, and his breathing was still heavy, but he sounded better than he had a moment ago. His wide eyes scanned the shadowy interior of the sawmill, finally resting on my face. Is it just you here? Yeah, it is. I mean, no, Toby was here too, but I don't know where he's gone and... What's that mean? Mr. Willow's voice cut through me, sharp and sudden. What's that mean he was here? His bony hand still gripped my shoulder. Mr. Willows stared into my face. And then, something else caught his eye. He glanced down, and I saw his expression change. Where the hell did you get that? I followed his gaze and saw the green tie, still clutched in my free hand. I stared down at it stupidly. Outside the sawmill, the wind gusted. The building around us shook and creaked, and it was as I looked back up at Mr. Willows that he moved his free hand, quick and agile as a man half his age, and fastened round my throat. Within seconds, both his hands were on my neck, squeezing. I choked in a half breath and stumbled backwards. My heel struck something on the concrete floor, and I went down, falling hard on my back. Mr. Willows came down on top of me. I felt pain lance through my back, felt the breath whoosh out of me like air from a balloon. Mr. Willow's face was inches from mine now, red and wrinkled, teeth gritted like a dog. His grip around my neck was impossibly strong, a rigid hand of bone. I reached up my hands to grab his arms and tried to break his hold on me, but I couldn't do it. My hands were suddenly too weak. My head felt thick and heavy, and my vision filled with blotches that were the colour of red stains on concrete. When Mr. Willow spoke to me, he sounded like he was about to cry. I didn't mean it, Jamie. I swear I didn't. I liked you boys, you know that. He tightened his grip. But I can't let you tell. My vision wavered. Everything was shades of brown and grey. I saw Mr. Willow's face, red and panting above mine. I saw the cobweb-strewn beams in the sawmill's roof. I saw the rain lashing down against the clearing outside the bluey-black curtains. And finally, before my eyes drifted shut, I saw Toby. I saw Toby looming over Mr. Willows, taller than I'd ever seen him before. I saw Toby, his face a shadowy blank beneath his dark curls, reaching out a hand towards the man choking the air out of me. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was the sound of screaming. I've been in counselling for the past few weeks. Ever since I got out of hospital, I have bruising around my throat, which is still pretty sore, but the doctors say it will heal soon. It's my mind that might take longer. My parents found me that Saturday morning when they woke up, passed out in our driveway, covered in mud, soaked through and unconscious, half dead. Somehow, after coming round in the sawmill, I'd managed to half stumble, half crawl my way back home. With the injuries I had, nobody can believe I managed to make it on my own. What they don't know is that I wasn't. I don't remember much of that journey back. It's all a blur of pain and numbness and shadows. But I do remember Toby. I remember him by my side the whole way, helping me along, encouraging me to get back up whenever I fell face down in the mud. Sometimes I thought I heard his voice clearly, and other times it seemed to blend and fade with the wind. But it was always there. It didn't take them long to find his body. Toby had been buried in a shallow grave, somewhere among the trees that ran around the edge of the clearing, within about 100 meters of the sawmill. Within about 100 meters of the spot where Mr. Willows tried to strangle me. The same spot the police found him, after they came to our house and I wrote the word sawmill on a notepad with a shaking hand. When his cause of death came back, they said it was a heart attack that killed him, that the strain of running and then trying to choke me must have caused something in his chest to rupture. I'm the only one that knows better. I've seen Toby once since I got out of the hospital. Just once. It was a Saturday morning and it was early. I'd had trouble sleeping. I woke up from whatever nightmare I'd been having in a sweat. My duvet twisted up around me, and before my eyes were even fully open, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It could have been a bird outside, or a distant neighbour working in the garden, or it could have been the sound of small stones striking a window. I swung my legs out of bed and got up to check. I didn't see Toby at first. When I parted the curtains, the sunlight was so strong it made me squint. It poured into the garden like liquid gold, bathing the grass in its yellow glow. Toby stood in the centre of that glow. When my eyes finally adjusted, I saw him. His form wavered in the morning sun, half lost in the light, the opposite of a shadow. But it was definitely Toby, smiling up at me, standing in the same spot he always used to stand whenever he came to call for me. There were so many things I could have said to him then, so many things I wanted to say, but in the end, I settled for a smile. It was all I had time for. As I stared down into the garden, the morning shifted, the sky altered, and Toby was gone as quickly as he'd come. A curly-haired boy, my best friend, fading in a patch of sunlight. When Andrea first saw us, it was love at first sight, and the feeling was entirely mutual. We were elated when Andrea adopted us, and seamlessly began referring to her as our mother. She made us feel loved, which is something we've never previously experienced other than among ourselves. Andrea, or Mummy as we popularly refer to her, gave us new everything: clothes, toys, and friends to play with. Even our own room in the beautiful condo where we lived. Her friends always made a big fuss over us whenever they visited, complimenting on how cute we looked in our matching outfits. Their favourites were these light orange shirts and dark blue suspenders that had light pink hearts, which displayed our abbreviated names: Andy, Randy, and Sandy. The fact that Mommy made them herself and why those outfits were so meaningful, and made us really excited whenever she picked them out for us to wear. We especially enjoyed when any of Mommy's friends came over with kids our own age. We'd have so much fun spending hours playing games like house and hide and seek, but my favourites were the ones made up on the spot. She confided her deepest secrets and lamented about her problems whenever she slept in our room, or vice versa, always saying how much it meant for us to just listen. Mummy even took us to a job a few times, where we received nothing but compliments from her co-workers. We grew extremely attached to Andrea during those first few months, and knew Mummy's sentiments were the same. Each of us thought this seemingly unbreakable bond with her would last forever, one that we strongly cherished and were eternally grateful to have. For the first time in our young lives, me and my siblings felt that we were part of a true family. That all changed when Mommy started seeing Tim. Apparently, he worked in the same building as Mommy's job, and they would frequently talk if they ever bumped into each other during the workday. Tim was a computer programmer, but his biggest passion was sports, namely the major ones like baseball, hockey, football and basketball. He was especially into stats and analytics, namely the highly advanced ones, which he used to gauge value or track progress of a player or team. He wrote for a few different sports blogs, but rarely posted any content. Tim was primarily focused on his social media accounts, where he did have a large following and engaging in heated discussions where he tried to prove people wrong and make them see things his way. There's no denying Tim's formidable wealth of knowledge on these topics, but he was a pompous know-it-all and had a monstrous ego. According to Tim, his outlook was the only acceptable way to properly interpret a scenario or back an opinion with facts. As more time passed, I noticed his defective trait of his applied to practically everything he did, in addition to his profound sports analysis. He was constantly correcting or critiquing Mommy on everything, to the point where it was affecting her confidence and overall morale. Tim was a very condescending individual and seemed to take pleasure at correcting and lecturing Mommy on the right way of doing something, or even how to think. We knew he was ultimately conditioning her to be just like him, and it concerned us when she vented about Tim's overly abrasive and controlling qualities, especially when Mommy became convinced that she actually needed what she called Tim's, quote, necessary discipline in her life. Even some of her friends tried advocating for Mommy to break it off with Tim, but she gave them the same bland excuse. "He's good for me," she would always say, sounding like a robotic recording during each instance. "He gives me structure, companionship and discipline, things I've never had before that I need to become a better person." Tim wasn't a big fan of us either, and seemed quite jealous of the love and attention we got from Mommy. Whenever he would use the computer in our bedroom, Tim would kick us out until he was finished, saying we made him feel uncomfortable, whatever that means. The three of us were powerless to stop Mommy from continuing to see Tim, or at least bring to her attention how toxic his belittling, dominion-seeking personality was becoming. She went from being loving and vivacious to a timid shell of her former self that questioned everything she did and said, especially with Tim. It got worse when Tim started spending nights, which eventually turned into stays lasting weekends or days at a time. Tim's influence slowly encroached into our home, from how the furniture was arranged to what foods he wanted Mommy to cook or shows they watched. We grew extremely fed up with Tim's unrelenting impositions and neared our breaking point when Mommy told us that Tim was not only moving in, but wanted to make our room into an office, or as he called it, his analytics station. "Tim's going to become part of our little family," Mommy told us one night with a tone of blatantly forced enthusiasm in her voice. "We'll be more complete now than we were before." We brandished our smiles when Mommy relayed the news to us, but were boiling with anger and concern on the inside. All three of us could tell, just by looking in Mommy's eyes, that deep down, she didn't want Tim moving into our home. Their relationship took such a toll on her that Mommy genuinely felt she actually needed Tim to function in all aspects in life. We decided to act when he brutally berated Mommy one night after she reorganized the linen closet but missed one minor detail among Tim's specific convoluted instructions. She locked herself in our room, where we tried soothing her as she held us tightly, during which Tim continued lecturing her from the other side of the door. What repulsed me the most were the petty apology acts Tim would pull whenever they fought that won Mommy over every single time. He was breaking our Mommy if she wasn't already in shambles. Considering how warm, giving and personable Mommy was, seeing her treated this way, while those lovable aspects about her slowly deteriorated, was overwhelmingly objectionable. That was when we decided to get rid of Tim by any means necessary. All we needed was for him to give us an opening. Me and my siblings formulated a plan and gathered the materials we needed for its implementation: a roller skate from Mummy's days playing roller hockey, and a kitchen knife. All we had to do then was wait for our chance. It came one day when Mommy left to run some errands after quadruple checking with Tim that everything she had listed was accurate. Once she left, Tim put some boxes of his belongings into our room and smirked as he walked up to the three of us. "Enjoy it while it's still yours. By the end of the month, this room is going to be my domain," Tim said arrogantly, his face scrunching when he put special emphasis on the words "my" as he spoke in his deep, nasally voice. "You'll be more out of the way, wherever I wind up putting you three." Everything about Tim was always excruciatingly unbearable at that moment. It took every ounce of self-restraint I had from smashing that enormous beak-like nose. Just looking at Tim sent my mind into a frenzy. He had this thin face with a curved narrow chin, large cheekbones, and a massive nose that seemed 2 sizes too big for his head. He wore black-framed glasses over his small light green eyes, always had some sort of sports hat covering his short dark greyish-brown hair, and had this exasperating habit of constantly keeping his mouth tightly parted, revealing his row of yellowish-white teeth. Simply put, he had an extraordinarily punchable face, one I spent nights on end pondering how someone as smart and bright as Mommy could have taken such a liking. With a slight snort, Tim laughed at his own words as he left our room and sat in the den. Our bedroom was located directly across, which gave us a clear view of Tim. He kept flipping between a few different games and frantically typing on his laptop, most likely making a slew of social media posts that coincided with whatever he was watching. Tim was consumed with his pretend life as a wannabe pro sports analyst, so we knew he wouldn't notice when we dispersed to put our plan into motion. While Sandra entered the kitchen to make the distraction, I retrieved the knife we previously concealed in between the mattress and box spring. Randall took the roller skate and hid in the hallway closet, which was about halfway between the den and kitchen. I remained in the bedroom and would emerge when Tim responded to the impending crash. Sandra did just what she promised and pushed over the glass vase sitting on the kitchen table. It made a loud shatter that instantly got Tim's attention, who shot upright and asked what the hell that sound was out loud to himself. Soon as he walked out past our bedroom, I stepped out into the hallway, tightly clutching the knife, making sure to remain roughly 70 or so inches behind Tim, his approximate height. My footsteps were very quiet and calculated, so Tim was totally unaware I was trailing closely behind. I managed to keep up with his hasty, urgent steps, but started getting nervous, thinking Tim might reach the kitchen before Sandra could get into position. Fortunately, Sandra, being the reliable individual she was, had gotten ready in time. Tim was 3 or 4 feet from the kitchen entrance when Sandra stepped into view, causing him to freeze mid-step. "What?" was all Tim could say as he exchanged stares with Sandra, who wore a widened smile and slowly cantered ahead while she started waving at Tim. Looking like he knew something was amiss, he slowly started backing up, making sure not to take his eyes off Sandra. Tim was so focused on her, he didn't even notice the closet door nudge open wide enough for Randall to push out the roller skate, which slid directly into his path. Tim released a fearful, yelp-like shriek upon tripping over the roller skate. The foot stepping on it shot out forward, while the rest of his body jerked back, causing him to immediately lose his balance. Twisting 180 degrees as he fell, I still maintained that precise distance behind Tim, and firmly held the kitchen knife vertically in place, with its pointed blade aimed toward the ceiling. My precision was on point. The knife's entire blade and part of its handle effortlessly sank through Tim's left eye, its serrated tip bursting through the back of his head. A loud smack-like crunch signified the impact his face made when it slammed into the floor. All was silent after that as we gathered around Tim's stiff, twitching body, watching the blood seep out from under his butchered face and collect around his head. The most gratifying part for me, aside from how enormously successful we were at pulling this off, was the monstrosity of a nose Tim had got absolutely smashed during the fall. It looked like a crumpled, bloodied accordion tightly wedged between his face and the floor. Mommy reacted exactly how we expected when she returned home. After a spree of incessant frantic hollering and wailing, she broke into hysterics and just barely managed to hold it together enough when she called 911. The police and paramedics arrived quickly, along with Mommy's parents and some of her friends. She was severely traumatized by the incident and completely inconsolable, although part of me thinks some of those tears were of relief that she was out of Tim's shadow, possibly joy. She eventually came in our room to step away from the commotion and hugged us tightly. In between her soft sobs and sniffles, Mommy kept mumbling about how she couldn't and didn't want to believe this was happening. 2 police officers, an older and younger one, entered the bedroom, saying they were ready for Mommy to make a statement. Still sobbing, we watched her step back into the hallway with the older police officer. It truly hurt to see Mommy like this, and we felt absolutely horrible for doing what we did, but knew it was for the better. Tim was slowly eating away at Mommy from the inside and making her a totally different person. Even if she tried ending things herself, Tim would probably find a way to twist the words and turn the tables, or convince Mommy that's not what she actually wanted. The pain was fresh now, but we knew she would heal quickly. Mommy was a strong person, and we hoped she'd rejoice at the aspect of things going back to normal with our little family. The young officer stayed in the room and was staring at us intently, while me and my siblings sat on the bed. He seemed fixated on a particular detail about us and had a groaningly suspicious look in his eye that made me extremely uneasy, which is something I thought he sensed. "What the hell are you still doing in here?" the older police officer who walked out with Mommy asked as he re-entered the room. The younger police officer continued watching us closely for a couple more seconds before replying. "Doesn't something just seem off about them?" he asked softly. I tensed sharply. "What are you talking about?" the older police officer asked out loud, seeming irritated at what his colleague was saying. "I don't know," the younger officer said, squinting as he leaned in closer, making me increasingly convinced we were about to be compromised. "I can't quite put my finger on it." The older officer looked like he quickly ran out of patience and hastily started guiding the young officer back towards the door, which filled me with relief. I nearly chuckled when I heard what the older police officer said to his younger colleague as they left the room. "Well, there's plenty to do out here that you can put your finger on. I'm not sure what you found so fascinating about them. They're just dolls." I didn't know anything was wrong until the police arrived. As it turned out, Henry had been missing for 12 hours. His wife had left the front porch light on for his expected late arrival, as usual, and nestled into bed. But when she awoke the next morning, the sheets beside her were still folded flat. Hallway shouts went unanswered, as did phone calls. There was no truck in the driveway, and after a search of the house proved fruitless, she called the police to file a missing persons report. Our rural town is small, population 2,723, and because of the far proximity from large cities, we have no team to rally behind during professional sporting events. So, the pillar of the community is, and always has been, the local high school team, where fans arrive in droves to support the kids no matter the sport. Because of this outpouring of support, everyone in town knows Henry. Not only did he attend every game with gloves fashioned to resemble cougar paws, but he also had been the school custodian since the Cougars won the championship in '91. The town adored him. I adored him. So you can imagine my frustration when 3 sheriff's deputies made loops around my property while the sheriff, portly and stone-faced as ever, interrogated me about the truck they found across the road from my driveway. I told you, Henry's always parked there so my muddy driveway wouldn't get his truck dirty. I don't know why his truck is still there. What do you mean by that? The sheriff asked incredulously. My heating unit was acting up. It made rattling noises, and the house smelled like gasoline, so I needed someone to take a look. You know Henry does have jobs around town, so I called him and asked him if he would look at it. Did he? I suppose. I wasn't home. Me and some buddies watched NFL at Hooligans until late, and before you ask, no, I didn't drive drunk. So, you saw him? No. The sheriff grunted and scratched his stubbly chin. If you never saw him, then how did you know he came by? Because Henry left the back door unlocked. Oh, and he also forgot to lift up the attic ladder. When I came back inside, the house was freezing. How did he get in? I reminded him where to find the spare key. So you trust him? You two are friends? Absolutely. It may seem strange, but I've known Henry my whole life. I allowed him to do the same thing the last 2 times he's done work in my house. Let himself inside my home. Once was the patch of some drywall, and the other time he replaced the sink basin in the guest bathroom. I trust him. His last known location, and this is coming from his wife too, is this house. Your house. And now he's vanished. I glowered at him and lifted myself from the couch. Are you saying I'm a suspect? No, he said with a trace of laughter. I didn't believe him. He lifted from the recliner and patted my shoulder. We're questioning everyone. Part of the job. Did you see his truck when you soberly came home last night? From what your deputy said earlier, it was parked near the cattle gate. I came back from Hooligans in the other direction. So no, I didn't see it. Had I seen it, I probably would have called you myself. When did you return from the bar? Last night, probably midnight or 1. If I contact those buddies of yours, the ones from the bar, they'll corroborate your story? Yes, sir. I hope you do call them. He nodded rapidly, an acknowledgement of disbelief about most, if not all of the things I told him. He hitched his belt up under his belly and plodded out of my living room and toward the porch. Before the front door could close on him, he caught the knob, then poked his head through the threshold. Before I go, I got to ask, do you believe in coincidences? I palmed the back of my neck. I guess so. Why? When did you buy this house? Last summer. Couldn't pass up on the price. He edged a shoulder into the foyer, followed by a boot, then looped a thumb in his pocket. When I was a boy, about 9 or 10, a little girl in my class went missing. Everyone, and I mean everyone, went out searching for that little girl. They even used hounds at one point, but she was never found. Then, a few decades later, a 70-year-old woman went missing. Food still in the pantry, milk still in the fridge, cash, credit cards, car keys, all in a purse. Poof, just gone. Never found her either. Tragic. Really it is, but how does that involve me? Because both those people went missing while they lived in this house. There was a hitch in my breath. Cement shoes, hammering heart, tunnel vision. The sheriff tossed me a sidelong glance. And now we have Henry at this house 1 minute, then poof, gone like the other 2. So, do you believe in coincidences? Oh, that's strange, Sheriff, I'll admit, but I have no part in this. Can I give my buddy's info now? My mind reeled as the sheriff returned to his cruiser with the names and numbers of the friends I were with the night before. He was soon followed by the other deputies that had been scouring through the pasture and thickets for any trace of the missing custodian. I wanted to join the search. I really did. But despite my factual answers to the sheriff, I believed he pinned me as a suspect from the get-go. After a few beers to calm my nerves, I dialed my buddies one by one to explain about the possible phone call from the authorities, only for each to inform me they had already been contacted in the last 10 minutes. Panic set in. What started as confusion had morphed into something much worse. I was a suspect in the disappearance of Henry, a beloved figure in our town. Also, there was something troubling about the sheriff's anecdote. Not one, but two disappearances had a common thread, and I was living in it. I doubt I blinked for the next hour during my online search for any evidence that could prop up what he had told me, that my house was cursed or haunted, that a construction of wood and metal and screws could instigate the disappearance of a human being. I clicked and read and bookmarked any pertinent information. As it turned out, or perhaps because he didn't know, the sheriff had understated the truth. My research informed me that my home, a ranch-style single-story with a vaulted ceiling and two-car garage, had been built in 1964 by a palmy banker. He built it for his wife and family that eventually expanded to include 4 daughters. I came across a write-up that portrayed them as a wholesome group: daughter who enjoyed ballet, a homemaker wife who could cook a fierce Thanksgiving turkey, a proud father who enjoyed barbecues and church services. But all that changed when he claimed his bedroom window flashed with celestial light one early morning, and, upon further inspection, he discovered a hole that had been burned in the roof. Lightning, the article quoted what the banker had said. I thought it was lightning. The following week, he left for a 3-day business trip. When he returned, his wife and 4 daughters were gone. Authorities at the time dispelled the notion of murder or kidnapping. They blamed it on a fleeing wife who suffered through a furtive abusive relationship, and they never did any meaningful investigation to support alternative claims. The banker's body was found the day after the investigation was called off, hanging from a backyard oak. I found several articles dated a few years later about a young girl that went missing while her mother packed outdated Christmas decorations from the attic to be stored in the shed, going back and forth between the two for an hour until the joyous laughter of her daughter became an eerie silence. Gone. Taken right from under her nose by a pervert or some maniac. This was one of the stories that sheriff had told me. I read on, shocked at the words in the newspaper, quotes from grieving family members begging for a safe return that never occurred. Minutes later, I found an article about an elderly woman. The sheriff was not exaggerating. Food still in the pantry, milk still in the fridge, cash and credit cards, and her keys to an old Volvo were all found in her purse. Poof, the sheriff had said. No wonder the home was at such a low price when I purchased it. Unsolved mysteries tend to bring down real estate value. I remember the realtor giving me the spiel. Never had a rodent problem, never had a leaky roof, never had a bug infestation, solid foundation, plenty of space, and it could be yours for such a low price, she told me. Be a homeowner. Come on, a millennial homeowner is a rarity these days. Her wily speech had worked. I felt stupid, duped into the purchase of a cursed residence. Strangely, I didn't believe in the supernatural, and had never personally seen a ghost or phantom, or one of those floating orbs of light. To me, it was a way to energize tourism, feast on people's nightmares. But on that day, I was caught up in something unusual. It's one thing to read about the history, but now police were showing up to my home with guileful smiles, prodding eyes that surveyed for evidence, skepticism when I spoke. The nightmare was no longer in the past. It was later that day, and the loud knocks made me wince. 2 deputies stood on my porch, a pair of tall muscleheads that were obviously sent to intimidate. One more look around, they asked if I would allow it. I had nothing to hide, so their request was granted. This circuit around my home was much more in depth than the one around my property, and as I followed them around like a lost puppy, they upturned containers and leafed through my clothes and ransacked every cabinet. I was annoyed, sure, but felt I was helping the investigation, thinking when they realised I wasn't involved, then they could focus their attention elsewhere. "Sir, we're about done. Do you have a basement or attic?" "Attic. Mind if we go ahead?" I said. "Be my guest. Let me know if the heating unit is coughing again." The attic ladder was unfolded from the ceiling and stabilised in the hallway. After lighting his mag light, the bigger of the two deputies began his creaky climb into the dark void above. When the darkness swallowed him, and the only sign of his location was the occasional flicker of light seen through the access opening, the second deputy planted a foot on a grooved rung and rubbed the bridge of his nose. There was a metallic rattle, then a large wrench protruding from the opening, followed by the looming presence of the attic lawman. He called out to his partner, "Got a toolbox with Henry's name on it. Cuff him." In a blur of motion, the officer near me whipped my arm behind my head in one swift motion. In the corner of my eye, I saw him remove plastic restraints from his belt. I cringed in pain and shouted my innocence as I had already told the sheriff Henry had inspected my HVAC the night before, but was blatantly ignored. Yet, in the commotion, I heard a deep wallop from above. When my arm was released, it wasn't because of my indignation. A horrific shriek blasted from the attic. A yell of a man in pain. An odd strobe effect was all I could see in the inky square above the ladder as the officer's flashlight spun and twitched in the darkness above. Then, all sound stopped. The officer beside me gazed up the ladder. "Jones? Jones, what's wrong?" Silence. He turned to me, but his mind was in a deliberation. "Sir, I didn't do anything." "Shut up. Arms through here. Now!" Panicked, the officer used the plastic, disposable cuffs on my right wrist and looped the excess through a metal ladder hinge before fastening my left wrist. He raced upstairs to his friend. My shouts were ignored. My pleas lost in the frenzied mind of a spooked cop. The creak of the rungs moaned in agony against his weight, but were barely audible against the beckoning calls to his lost brother in blue. He dipped the top of his head into the lightless loft, then lifted his torch, spinning the beacon in a 360-degree angle. Once satisfied, he ascended the ladder. Darkness enveloped him. I tugged against the handcuffs, but it was pointless. I was tethered to the hinge. "Oh my God," uttered a feeble voice from above. There was a thundering noise, footfall, then another scream of agonized pain. Unable to believe what happened, I stood in stupid amazement at the featureless black square, waiting for the pair to materialize and joke about the size of a rat or cockroach. All a joke, a trick to play on the stupid, shackled suspect. My throat seized into itself as I waited, gaping at the nothing above my head. The muscleheads never appeared. The void of my attic seemed to swallow a pair of deputies right in front of my eyes, and yet I still didn't believe it. I jerked madly at my restraints, trying to jostle the ladder into a creaky surrender, but the screws held firm. It felt as if the frame of black was staring back at me, a window into oblivion. I started to weep. Frantic calls for help went unanswered, until I heard a voice. Outside, a car door slammed. Before I swiveled my head to the window, my voice rose in a shrill pitch, begging for assistance. The front door was kicked in, and the sheriff turned the corner, gun drawn. "What the hell is going on? Where's Jones and Anderson?" "They're upstairs." Before he could set a worn boot on a rung, I shouted, "No, don't." "What happened?" "Something. I don't know. Something's up there. Cut me loose." Uncertainty was swept away when he saw the terror in my face and picked up on the trembling in my voice. In a moment of judgment, he scratched under his chin and alternated with sights of me and the attic's maw. He gave a quick shrug. His pocket knife released my hands from the link, and I explained what happened as efficiently as possible. He took in a lungful of air and removed his maglite. "Your house, your lead," the sheriff said as he thrust the flashlight to my chest. "I'm not going. I don't know what—" "Sounds like my deputies were injured. For all I know, you've set traps up there. You go first." He flicked his pistol a little, and I started up the ladder, my new plastic bracelets scratching the grooved threads of each rung. By the time I was on the boundary of where the hallway light met the obscurity of the attic, I was shaking. "Hurry up, those men have families," the sheriff called out from behind. I plunged into the murky frontier and immediately cast every wall and light with rapid turns of the torch. When one side was clear, I spun around to make another corner visible, then another. I got a whiff of natural gas, the smelly McCaptain doing his job, the smell of rotten eggs, sulphur, hell. The sheriff was now on the third step of the ladder. "Well?" "Nothing." "What?" "There's nothing, it's just an attic." A series of rafters ribbed the area above me, and struts rose from the attic floor to supportive beams, sending wicked shadows around the space with every turn of my wrist. Joists emerged out of fluffy pink stuff at random intervals, but were otherwise covered by heaps of the rosy clouds scattered throughout the attic. Pads of the stuff overwhelmed almost every spot my flashlight landed. I found a bundle of galvanized pipes that flowed into the heating unit. The metal casing was flipped open, and it emitted a tiny echo when it thumped. I took a step deeper into the attic, and my foot clanked against the old toolbox, the wrenches and pliers shuffling from the movement. The sheriff groaned his way up the ladder, then joined me on the plywood board that flanked the ladder opening. He removed his cell phone and turned on the flashlight app. With both lights running at once, only small drifts of darkness hugged the corners. Everything else was visible. "You son of a... Was this some kind of trick? I swear, Sheriff, they came up here. Both of them." He balanced his way to a narrow strip of plywood, holding his phone at an angle to inspect the mounts of pink to his right. I took a step on an exposed joist and kept my balance with an overhead collar tie. "Careful, don't fall through the ceiling," the sheriff warned. I looked around, amazed at the volume of vibrant colour. "What's all the pink stuff?" "Insulation. Fiberglass insulation to be exact. I've never seen so much installed before. Kind of an overkill. It looks so delicate, like cotton candy." I reached for it. "Hey, don't touch it, your hands will itch for hours." "Don't touch it?" I asked, bending down to get a more solid look. "Sounds dangerous." "No, it's perfectly safe if—" The narrow plank of wood gave way and the sheriff tumbled into the fluffy mass below. As I approached, he mumbled a string of vulgarity and was busy rolling on his back like an upended turtle. His palm caught a joist and began lifting himself, leveraging his weight with his knee. Then, he let out a blood-curdling scream. He tossed his phone and began yelling for help, his arms groping and reaching out for me, while the shine from his whirling phone strobed through the air. To correct the dimness and my bewilderment, I pointed my flashlight to the ailing officer and watched as his attempts to lift himself onto a joist was hindered. He grasped the wooden support and strained to roll over. When he pivoted, there was no longer cloth covering his back, but a viscous tar substance growing taut against his bare skin. I thought he had dug his heel into the pillowy fluff to gain traction, but upon a longer inspection, witnessed the fluff engulf his boot, rolling over his lower leg like clouds in the wind. By the time I set the flashlight on the ground and balanced my way down the narrow lumber, half of his body was submerged under knolls of pink. My hand embraced his, and after anchoring myself to the beam with another arm, pulled the sheriff with all of my might. He was coughing and sputtering blood, not yelling words per se, but hoarse, onomatopoeias of agony. One arm that had previously been embedded suddenly elevated into the open air, but when I reached out for it, and the muscles were steaming and pulsing. he continued to rise out of the blushy lumps as I hauled him closer to freedom. Then, the pink stuff pulled back. His hand was sucked out of my grasp. When the sheriff finished his plunge, his rotund face slipping beneath the swelling insulation, he was still and no longer calling out. I tiptoed along the beam and fetched my flashlight at the mouth of the opening before my descent. A faint mechanical whirring noise caught my attention. The smell of natural gas grew strong again and gave me an idea. Before I could find out if the insulation was sentient enough to chase its prey, I raced down the ladder and folded it up. I stood on a chair and duct taped the narrow slits of the opening and hinges, then closed every ceiling register in my home. I duct taped an ice pack around my thermostat, then set the temperature to 90. Before I exited, I stuffed a lighter in my pocket. I went to the shed and collected a pair of 5-gallon gasoline jugs that were filled to the brim. My plan was to wait 5 hours before I incinerated my home, but calls were streaming from the ownerless police cars in my driveway, so I knew my time was limited. I waited an hour, then 2. On the 3rd, I heard my name and address on the radio, so I went to work. I spent nearly 10 minutes dousing the pine straw on my roof with the gasoline, but saved enough to crudely fashion a Molotov cocktail from a strip of cloth and an empty beer bottle. I lit the cloth and tossed the flaming projectile onto my roof just as the wailing sirens became audible. The fire caught and incinerated the pine straw in an instant. Without warning, a massive explosion obliterated half of my roof, shattering every window of my home and knocking down the east wall. Debris rained from above, and I kept under an oak tree to avoid injury. The fire took and ate its way through the attic, and ultimately my entire house. As the flames licked up the sides of my house, and the glow of the blaze burned with an unparalleled magnificence, I was handcuffed and violently tossed into the back of a deputy's cruiser. The officers watched the fire, reporting to the dispatcher about arson and homicide, begging for a fire truck as soon as possible. Looking back, I'm not sure which was more strenuous, that day or the ordeal that followed. I was treated as a murderer until a vigilant search of the charred remains of my house was finalized. No bodies were found. Refusal to believe my story was common, but I endured. After 3 years of court battles, I am a free man. Too many inconsistencies, I later found out many jurors said. Not enough evidence or motive. The reason I'm telling this story is simple. Last week, a man approached me in a diner and slid into the booth across from me. He was pale and twitchy, nervously eyeing out the window like he was being followed. He told me he was serving the Army National Guard several years ago when his unit was mobilized for a covert operation. Their job, he explained, was to cordon off a small quarantine zone, keep anyone from entering. Simple, routine. He leaned in close when he told me the quarantine zone was the spot where my house burned and the surrounding field. He was assigned the mission the day after everything transpired. Too bad it didn't belong to me anymore, as the property had been eminent domained by the government and seized immediately after my arrest. Nervously, the stranger said that scientists wearing hazmat suits began collecting wads of bright pink material and sequestering them to steel containers. Fellow soldiers in his National Guard unit joked they were protecting a cotton candy stand. He said in a wistful tone that his fellow soldiers weren't joking anymore. When I asked him why he was telling me all this, he grimaced. Before I could slide out to the booth and leave the stranger, he clung to my wrist. "I'm trying to tell you," he said with a fearful quiver. "It got out. The pink stuff got out. It could be anywhere." I've begun to accept that some things about my town just aren't normal. I've seen things in the woods, Things on a regular residential block. Things that just aren't square with my comprehension of reality. My friend Sonny isn't normal either. I'm not really sure he's my friend, to be honest. But I just had this feeling. You know, that feeling that dogs you and itches you and crawls all over your brain, that he knew more than he was letting on. Especially after he tried to cure my chronic unemployment by sending me to a particular factory with some nasty, beyond nasty health code violations. Anyway, so it was early morning and I hadn't slept at all. I had recently injured my finger in the aforementioned job. That didn't pan out and it hurt like hell. The pain kept me awake though, which, in my questionable sound opinion, was a good thing. Couldn't go home, couldn't sleep, had to see Sonny. He lived a couple streets over. The kind of guy who it's easy to be on and off friends with. You kind of forget about them until you don't. That makes me sound like a pretty garbage human, and hell, maybe I am. According to my family, I can't do anything right. It wasn't like that, really though. Sonny and I, we hung out sometimes, and sometimes, for long times, we didn't. He had no family that I know of, and lived in a house by himself. This creaky old town leftover, with a sway-backed roof and faded pink paint. The kind of pink that doesn't look frilly, just old and secretive. The house was a bit of a Frankenstein too. Awkward bits and junctures seemingly added at random, so that it looked like an electrocuted junkyard splayed out by itself under a run of power lines. When I got there, no one appeared to be home. But that's how Sonny's house always looked. I have no clue how the dude gets around whenever he actually convinces himself to leave the house. Except this time, of course, when I actually needed to talk to him, he really wasn't there. It wasn't like I could just ring him up either. Sonny doesn't own a phone. Not a landline, not a cell phone, no car either. I literally have no idea how he survives. Probably an apocalypse bunker full of canned soup. After some of the stuff I've seen, that's the last thing that would surprise me right now. Anyway, so I banged on the door, careful to use my non-dominant hand so I didn't jar my healing finger. Paint popped off under my knuckles and a squirrel rustled sullenly in the yard. Place was dead. All barren grass and weeds and crooked shutters clacking morosely in the winter wind. It wasn't much of a wind, but it was still damn cold and I wasn't wearing a jacket. I know it's stupid, but I have this thing against jackets. "Sonny!" I shouted. A crow coughed angrily. I scuffed my boot on the doorstep, kicking a pile of soot. Fine, if Sonny wanted to ghost me, then he was going to pay for it. I was only going to get more shouty later. See, my anger has a tendency to simmer up rather than down, and the dude owed me an explanation for that terrible job referral. Annoyed, I walked around back just in case, like I expected him to be chilling at a glass garden table, feet up, sipping a lemonade or whatever. I just really wanted him to be there so I could shake some answers out of him. There was no garden or garden table back there behind the house, just a couple of bald tires and an encroaching tree line. I turned away, resigned, and finally ready to go home. Then, I heard it. Soft. Just a whimper, but distinctly. A baby's cry. I rubbed my eyes, which obviously did nothing for my hearing. But I was tired as a 3-year-old advertisement and my senses were hooked up crooked in my brain. Someone once told me that coyotes can sound like babies when they're trying to lure you in. No idea if that's true. No idea why they'd be lurking around Sonny's backyard in broad daylight. No idea why I even fixated on this tangent. I took another step, and again, a quiet cry, longer this time, burbling just behind me to the left. The trees were so far up the ass of Sonny's house that they created this heavy canopy, towering over me, bending arms, dropping shadows like an invasion. My skin started to get prickly, and my brain started to go, "Oh God, not again." I was past the point of explaining away the things I'd seen around town, so I should have known better. Again, The baby cry, plaintive, mewling and helpless. If there was any chance at all there was an actual child in there, now was the time to take an opportunity to not be a garbage human just once, right? That noble thought didn't make me any less hesitant as I towed my way further under the tree's shadows. The crying picked up, like the baby could hear me, and just as my feet touched the first lumpy roots of the woods, it stopped. Cut off. I peered around nervously. It really was dark back there. When I looked over my shoulder, I could barely discern Sonny's house in the gloom. Something rustled, and I whipped my attention back to the woods. Just haphazard rows of smooth trunks, impossibly tall trees. Their branches started at a height that seemed higher than Sonny's roof. Another rustle and a cry, louder, closer, just at my feet. I crouched and squinted. The forest floor was dirty, and leaves and curled up dead ferns and stripped twigs and something that looked like a chewed off squirrel's tail. And there, a hand. Small and grasping and chubby, poking out of the leaf litter like a mouth widening for air. God, I said, stunned and sickened. Hang on, just hang on. I scrambled, swiping dirt and forest mould. A deep, deep anger burning up from the pit of my stomach. Talk about human garbage. There was a child here, a baby suffocating in the dirt. I didn't have time to process the fact that this was happening in my friend's backyard. I uncovered more of the arm, skin soft as grave dirt. It waved limply, pale, near translucent and full of veins. Was it safe to try pull the whole kid out? I don't know. I didn't want to hurt it, but I was panicking, feeling weirdly like a grave robber, like a whole angry atmosphere had just crashed into my back. My hands were filthy now, soil crusted under my nails. I took out another scoopful of earth, and there was part of the baby's face. Its eyes were closed. There was something spidery, a ligament of some kind on the side of its head. I reached in, trying to cradle the baby in my hands, and gently pulled it out. But I couldn't. That thing on the side of its head was a root, and as the dirt fell away, I saw it extended all the way up its skull and sank into the flesh like a stem. The baby opened its eyes, blood red, just red, no whites, no blacks, and screamed. That's when the forest woke up. Wood groaned, leaves hissed, clumps on the forest floor I'd taken to just be leaves and dirt shuddered and began to travel, burrowing along, close to the surface in a trembling, advancing spearhead. The trees moved with them, dragged, reluctant, ambulatory carriages. They raised their roots and followed their masters. Another plump hand broke through the dirt, and another, reaching for me as the tide of earth came towards my shoes. The strange child I held bared its 3 rows of needle teeth and sank them into my hand. I swore, I shouted, I said a lot of things strung together that didn't make sense before I dropped the thing and ran. Stumbling backward, my elbows bounced off the bark that was suddenly behind me, blocking my exit, totally obscuring Sonny's house. The trees had shifted, creeping in behind me, moved by their malevolent root children. More hands erupted from the leaf mould, and red eyes glinted in the dark. My hand stung. It stung bad. Hell, it hurt worse than my still healing finger, and had already turned a nasty reddish purple. The mottled stain took up about half of my hand and had begun to swell. My head careened with heedless panic, and I ran in the only direction I could, deeper into the woods. For a long time, I could hear the thump and sliver of things through the ground, trees brushing against trees, making their chase, undeterred. Surely I was easy quarry, fuzzy with adrenaline and unfamiliar with territory. My hand pulsed with agony and my vision with blackouts. I tripped numerous times, each fall a century as I imagined those sharp monster teeth around my ankles. But the little buggers never caught me. Maybe they could only move so fast, dragging their trees. Or maybe they were herding me into a place I couldn't escape. Honestly, at this point, I didn't care. I didn't have the wherewithal to think of any of it. I blundered on until I was thoroughly lost, and the woods was close, and the air hung cold and sharp, and my shirt was ripped and torn along with the skin underneath. Pausing finally, I shivered. Each direction looking the same quiet, waiting dark, the same smooth, two tall trees, the same glitter of red eyes behind rocks and bushes, until I looked right at them and they vanished. The woods around Sonny's house weren't this deep. By now, I should have been through to another neighbourhood or something, but there was only green shadows, whispering bark, the sweet mouldering smell of decay. Oh God, I was lost. I was so lost. Put running on no sleep and possibly infection in my hand together, and I was so damn far from a mental Zen garden. I cursed Sonny to the ends of the earth. If I ever saw him again, I might cry at first at the recovery of civilization, and then, my anger warmed me just a little bit, just enough to start walking again, shivering in shirt sleeveless and goosebumped skin. I tried to tuck my hands under my armpits for extra heat, but my right hand screamed with pain. When I looked at it, it was shiny and melty looking, an uncomfortable black itching around my cuticles. I swayed and hit the dirt, a half-revealed rock jutting into my kidneys. And as I lay there, stunned, a numb paralysis scurrying up my leg in tingling waves, I thought, with a brief heart skip of horror, I felt a small, baby-soft hand brush my cheek. When I woke up, I was in bed. My bed. My blankets were tickling my chin, all stuffed at one side by the wall. I slapped them away and jolted upright. Everything appeared uncannily normal. Sun winding through the room, bright white with late winter morning, the room chilly and smelling faintly of pizza. I even wore my pyjamas, a rumpled AC/DC tee and flannel bottoms. The copper taste of nightmares hung behind my tongue, but maybe that's really all it had been. I yawned, mouth dry and sticky, and slumped my way to the bathroom, where the mirror showed me my face and arms, thrashed by branches in so many fine red lines. And my hand, swollen to the size of a baseball mitt and faded from blotchy red to muddy brown. I felt like I was hovering over myself, distant with alarm as I tried to bend my fingers. They were stiff, and the joints groaned, almost like a bent tree in the winter wind. Working the evening shift at a highway gas station is exactly what it's cut out to be. It's all cleaning bathrooms, selling cigarettes, and making sure nobody drives off with the gas nozzle still in the tank. But most of all, it's a lot of small talk. I remember when Todd, the manager, interviewed me for the job. He never asked me anything. We just talked about sports, his wife's cooking, and Hunter S. Thompson. I thought the interview was a bit odd at the time, but looking back, he was just vetting my small talk skills. But as much as I like shooting the breeze, my favourite time of the day is when the customers start dying off, which is around 6 on a weekday and 8 on a weekend. That's when you get to kick back, listen to the radio, pick up a book, and if you're bored, chew over anything interesting you might have heard from one of the customers that day. The gas station is located right at a fork in the highway. If you keep going straight, you're going on a new highway, the 301. If you hook right, then you're on the old one, the 93, which takes you through Windermoore. Taking the 93 adds an extra 40 minutes of travel time, so nobody but the people who live in old Windermoore take it. You might think that most of my customers are people passing by on the 301, but it's actually locals returning from work from out of town. Since the new highway was constructed, most people work out of town. One of these locals is a guy named Red, who comes to the station with his semi-truck every second day. He talks a lot without asking me much, which is my favourite type of folk. But one day, I noticed he was acting different, quieter. This went on for a couple of weeks, until I decided to fish for a reason. "Hey Chase, what's going on?" he hollered as he entered the store. He does that every time, yelling out for me before he even sees me. "Hey Red, not much, you?" I put my book down and wiggled the computer mouse to refresh the screen. "Yeah, not much either. Put 70 on," he said as he slapped 100 down on the counter. He leaned forward with an elbow on the counter and looked idly over his shoulder at the chip aisle. "How's the wife?" "Fine." "That's good. I'm glad to hear it. And the job?" "Just as fine." "Great. And the truck? Is the engine acting up again?" Red turned towards me and snapped, "What is this, the goddamn Inquisition?" "Sorry, Red, didn't mean to pry. You just seemed off lately, that's all." I plucked a 20 and a 10 and handed it to him. He folded the bills into his pocket and sighed. "Ah, jeez. You're a good kid, Chase. You remind me of my own, only he graduated high school a year before you and still hasn't found a job. But between you and me, I'm not doing too hot. Jane, my wife, her Uncle Thomas went missing a couple weeks ago. Did you hear about that?" He took off his hat and rubbed the last orange tussle of hair left on his head. Looking at him, I noticed for the first time the heavy bags under his eyes. "No, I hadn't heard about that. I heard about Abigail, but that's it. I'm sorry, Red, I had no clue." "Yeah, all anybody's heard about is that little girl Abigail. I pray to God she comes home, just as much as anyone else. But there's been 11 disappearances in Windermoore, and I bet you didn't know that, because all anybody talks about is Abby." He let out another sigh and put the cap back on his head. "You be careful getting home at night, okay? Something not right is going on here." He looked at me gravely, waiting for a reply. I told him I'd be careful, and to that he nodded his head and left the store. That was the last I ever saw of him. After Red left, only a couple customers came in that night. This meant that I had plenty of time to go on my phone and look into what he told me. Turns out, he was right. There had been 11 people in Windermoore declared missing in less than a month. It was strange for so many people to go missing in a town of that size. But what was even weirder was that, other than Abigail, they were all elderly. It depressed me a lot looking at their faces. They had all been so vulnerable. Midnight rolled around and I didn't waste a minute closing shop. I usually lock up and sit inside for half an hour, killing time before I have to catch the 12:45 bus. But I felt a bit cooped up that evening, so I decided to wait at the bus stop. It being May, the weather was warm and the skies clear. There are no streetlights on the stretch of highway between the station and the bus stop, but that night, the moon was full enough to cast shadows. The moonlight brightened the treetops that line the road, making the tree line look really nice against the starry sky. However, the forest remained dark. North, through that dense woods, is the old hospital. It hasn't been a hospital for 15 years now, but that doesn't mean it's empty. The story that kids tell each other these days is that the building is now an insane asylum for the most hopeless, incurable sorts. It's filled with serial killers, bloodthirsty cannibals, and deformed mutants who are more animal than man. It's the same story that was told when I was a kid. I remember being relieved as hell when I heard it was actually a private research centre called Geoforce with a focus on renewable energy. But no matter how boring the reality of that building was said to be, I was never able to look into that forest after nightfall. You never really truly grow out of your childhood fears. Although the forest always creeps me out, that night was worse than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every snap of a twig or rustle of a branch made me pick up my pace and curse under my breath. Sometimes I could swear that I heard a low growl coming from the bushes. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, that I read too much bad news on the internet earlier. But when I saw my bus stop illuminated in the distance, I couldn't help but sprint towards it. The bus stop has one of those advertisement screens that are lit up from underneath by fluorescent tubes. For years, it's been the same advertisement for a tyre shop on the West End. As I ran, I used that picture of the stack of tyres as my finish line, and I was only a few feet away when a piercing screech came from the woods. I spun around to look into the trees, but caught my foot on a rock and fell. I hurried back to my feet, and when I turned to the bus stop, someone was sitting on the bench. It was so unexpected that, I'm embarrassed to say, I let out a little shriek. She didn't move when I screamed, not even to look at me. At the time, I thought she was just trying to save my pride. "I'm sorry, miss. I hope it didn't startle you. I didn't see you there, that's all." I forced out a laugh, but she didn't look at me. I stepped closer to the bus stop. "Mind if I sit with you?" I looked at my phone. We still got half an hour. I waited for an answer, and when none came, I came over and sat next to her anyway. I pulled out my phone and was in the middle of some news article when a passing breeze brought something nasty with it. Bending one foot towards me, I inspected my shoe, and then the other. They were clean. I realized, to my horror, that the smell was coming from the lady beside me. "Are you feeling all right?" I blurted. She smelled like a pile of dead leaves and fresh crap. Old people have accidents, I thought to myself. It's normal, and she looked quite old and familiar, but I couldn't tell if I knew her or not, since she would not turn to look at me. I knew full well it's rude to stare, but at this point, I couldn't help it. She looked so disheveled, like she had been living rough, even though her clothes were expensive. Her black dress shoes, along with the bottom of her pants, were caked in dry mud. She also had pine needles in her hair, what looked to be sap smeared across the shoulder of her coat. "Miss?" I said as I reached out to touch her arm. But something in my gut made me recoil my hand. Call it survival instinct. With trembling hands, I turned on my phone and tried to open the call app, but I kept pressing the wrong app. The bench squeaked as she scooted towards me. I opened the call app, but my fingers were shaking and I couldn't open the keypad. She moved closer to me again. The smell was overwhelming and I muffled my nose with my jacket sleeve. I opened the keypad, pressed the number 9, and then 1, and then looked towards her. She was looking straight at me, with terrible, awful, bloodshot eyes that had what looked like holes drilled into them. One hole was smaller than the other, lined with a thin circle of icy blue, a blue iris. They weren't holes, they were her pupils, large and mismatched. You don't know how much an eye can tell you about a person, about their soul, until you're looking into dead ones. And she was dead. No two ways about it. Dead and missing. I recognized her from one of the news articles I had read. Her name had once been Ethel. I leapt from the seat just in time as she snapped her hands out to grab me. A slow-motion clip played through my mind of a frog shooting out its tongue at a fly. The irrational things that will go through your head in times of fear aren't all that irrational, you know. I was meant to be her little fly that night. I ran in the direction of town as fast as I could. As I ran, I looked back over my shoulder towards the bus stop, and what I saw only made me run faster. She was crawling into the woods. I'm no cross-country medalist, but I'm not too slow either. But as I ran, I could hear something in the woods catching up to me. As much as I tried, as much as I wanted to, I couldn't run any faster. My lungs were burning, tears were flowing down my face, and my shins ached with every slap of my shoe against the pavement. But still, whatever is in the woods was catching up to me. Headlights shone in the distance, like two angels in the dark. I began screaming at the top of my empty lungs as I ran head-on towards it. The thing in the woods started screaming too. It sounded, strangely enough, exactly like a human. The truck came closer, and closer, and closer, and so did the thing in the woods. I could hear it snapping branches as it veered towards the tree line. The truck stopped, and I ran to the passenger side door and tried to jerk it open, but it was locked. Out of the forest dashed the old woman with pasty skin that bounced up and down her face, and bulging red eyes fixed maniacally on me. The driver unlocked the door and pushed it open, and I jumped inside. She reached out for me with a long-nailed hand, but I closed the door on it and she shrieked. I screamed at the driver, "Drive, just drive," and pounded my fist on the lock. The tyres peeled on the pavement for a long moment before we sped away. Leaning over the seat, I watched through the back window as the woman faded from the glow of the red taillights. "Oh my god, oh 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 my god," I repeated for God knows how long. I turned back in my seat and looked at the driver. He was in his mid-30s, with a thick beard, pale face, and a shirt with a Geoforce logo on the sleeve. He stared ahead at the road. "She wanted to kill me. Oh my god, I've never been wanted dead before," I said with a wild laugh. He didn't laugh back. In fact, his expression didn't change at all. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Hey," I said. He didn't turn to look at me. "Hey," I said again, but louder. He still didn't turn. "Oh no, you're what she is," I screamed. The truck swerved across the road as he whipped his head towards me with a bewildered look on his face. "What the hell, boy? No, don't you ever say that to me," he yelled. He steered the car back into the lane and stared ahead, this time looking quite mad. "Oh, sorry. I just thought you were like her. I know this sounds crazy, but she's not human," he interrupted. "Yeah, human. You've seen her before?" "You could say that," he said distantly. "What does that mean?" "She comes from Geoforce. Well, technically the lady doesn't, but what she is comes from Geoforce, alright. The energy research place? Yeah, except we don't. They don't research energy. They research evil, to put it plainly." A small laugh wheezed out of my lips. I don't know why. It wasn't funny. He thought the same. "Go ahead and laugh, but if I hadn't saved your ass, that thing would have skinned you alive and wore you like pajamas. And you bloody well know it." He fumbled for a cigarette from the pack on the seat between us. I took out a cigarette, lit it, and passed it over. He rolled down the window and took a long drag. "They study evil. What makes it tick? First they started by lassoing every sicko they could find, from loony bins and prisons. They made them all live together, fight together, breed together, and sat back with a clipboard and just watched. They did this for a few years while looking into their DNA for something to peg the evil on. They wanted to grow their own fresh batch of bad." Is that how she was made? In a way. The military stepped in at a point and bought up the place, and that changed everything. They brought in these DNA samples, classified stuff that even I don't know where they came from, and just told them to splice it together. Splice together what Geoforce found and what the military brought. And then yeah, that's how she was made. Only it wasn't a human that they created. It was just something in a petri dish. But then somebody got infected by it, for a lack of a better word. And now it's loose. "You work for Geoforce. Is that where you're going right now?" I tried to keep my pitch normal, but it creaked near the end. He turned towards me, keeping the car straight this time, and looked me square in the eyes. "No, I'm never going back there. I'm skipping town tonight, and if anyone from Geoforce asks, we never met, you hear?" I nodded. He turned back to the road with a pained expression. "I've made a lot of mistakes in this life. I thought I was going to be something great, but then I got caught up with Geoforce, and once you do that, they make it awfully hard to leave, if you know what I mean. I'm glad I met you though, kid, because now I can leave this town knowing that I did something alright. In this sea of mess, I managed to throw out one life jacket. Where do you live?" "Oaken 12th. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take you home. You're going to lock all the doors and windows and sleep with a baseball bat beside you, or a gun if you have one. Then, first thing in the morning, you make up any excuse you have and get you and your family out of town. Tell your friends to do the same, okay?" We were in the town centre at this point. Our truck barreled down the main stretch, getting closer to Oak Road. "Okay, I'll do that. All of it. Thank you. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have made it. I thought I was a fast runner, but you weren't fast enough, I know. Nobody is. This your street?" "Yeah, the blue house on the left there is mine." He stopped in front of my house, leaned over me and opened the door. I got out and held the door open. I looked down and noticed there was a long bloody fingernail stuck to the hinge. I picked it off and inspected it before turning back to him. "Is there anything I can do to stop this thing?" "Nope. We can't even estimate how many people it's taken. All I can do is tell you to run. It will catch up eventually, but pray you'll be an old man by then. Just run fast and for as long as you can." He reached over and slammed the door shut in my face. I dropped the nail to the ground and watched as he drove off, the only moving thing in the night, that I could see anyway. I ran inside, locked all the doors and windows, and stayed awake all night holding my dad's baseball bat. In the morning, I made up a good excuse. I even got my grandma in on it and told her to call my parents to tell them that her hubby had a stroke. And we left town the next day. I'm currently sitting in an airport terminal, about to board our flight. Now you know what's out there, what's coming for us all. I may not be able to save it from coming, but I can save you from going to it. So, I let my final words to you be this: never, ever, under any circumstance, take the old highway through Windermoore. It was supposed to be beneficial all round, a win-win for everybody. But the betterment of people's lives was never the intention behind this service. They knew that the system couldn't hold that many people. They knew that the fantasy they were selling was a fraud. They knew exactly how to monopolize off of people's desperation, people that I cared about. Before I moved in with my parents, I fit the criteria of Islet's target demographic: lonely, exhausted, simultaneously over and understimulated by my occupation. While significantly stressful, the administrative work I was doing was far from fulfilling. I spent much of my time in my apartment, and the minimal human contact that I had outside of work typically consisted of fleeting, awkward interactions that resulted from accidental walking into someone's path on the sidewalk, or standing too long in front of the jars of pasta sauce at the grocery store. People were generally polite in these situations, but I could always spell out inconvenienced from the lines on their faces. So, when things got bad for me, I moved back home. I couldn't take the monotony any longer, at least not on my own. My parents never had the best life advice, and my younger brother's words were more often damaging to my self-esteem than constructive. But none of that really mattered. All of the pain I was experiencing, and even the numb lack thereof, would be replaced by reassurance. A hearty comfort, akin to the consumption of a steaming bowl of soup at the end of a day spent out in the cold. Whenever I was held by someone I loved. My mum pulled me into her arms when I arrived on a doorstep, and I was overwhelmed by the sensation of stability. My life was far from being put together, but this was an unwavering foundation that assured me I could set my roots here and finally branch out from them. "I missed you so much," she exclaimed, not completely unlike the way she would talk to a baby. Despite being well past my infant years, I didn't mind. My adolescent self would have certainly found it embarrassing, possibly even demeaning. But now, the chiming of my mother's voice hit my ears like a lullaby. It's funny, the way you see your parents as godlike before realizing just how humanly fallible they are, and then revert back to appreciating them as superhumans once you come to understand the gravity of sacrifices they've made for your benefit. Of course, that's only if they weren't selfish assholes. Not everyone is so lucky. I don't blame those who were truly alone for buying into the services. Islet was promising. An escapist fantasy, freedom from responsibilities. Just sign here, please. It was bait to anyone who didn't have a support system. Even though coming home was an overall welcoming experience, it didn't take me long to pick up on the fact that something was off. My parents would whisper to each other when they thought I wasn't looking, and I noticed the tenseness in their muscles that seemed to arise whenever we were together as a family. I found out why they were behaving this way one night after we sat down to a meal together. I asked my brother to pass the potatoes, and instead of simply complying, he remarked, "Why didn't you make use of your freakishly long arms and get them yourself?" I then made use of my long arms to slap him, and was taken aback by the feeling that came over me as my hand bounced off his shoulder. The action had felt weird, wrong, but not in the sense that hitting was probably not the most mature reaction to an insult. No, this didn't feel like my brother. We had fought countless times growing up, but there was always a smidgen of affection underlying our annoyance-fueled interactions. I didn't know how to explain the difference, but I could sense that that connection was gone now. He just seemed cold, unlike himself. I said nothing about it during dinner, but brought it up later to my parents. "Hey, does Darren seem weird to you guys?" "You've been away for a while," explained my mother. "Your brother has changed a lot in the last few years." "Like, how?" I asked, not satisfied with the response. A grim look passed over my mum's face, and before she could answer, my dad piped up, his voice saturated with intense emotion. "Tell her, Audrey. Damn it, we can't pretend things aren't different." "What's different?" My heart quickened its pace. It was unlike him to speak so boldly towards my mum. That was when I found out about Islet, a company based in my hometown that was the first with the technology to take the unique perspective that you have, your sentience, and move it elsewhere. They had created a server of sorts where you could live as if you were in your own body, but you would be occupying a virtual form. There, it was supposed to be like a utopia. You could do anything, within and outside the human ability, and everything was 100% free. Of course, when I've referred to this product, it's been something to be sold, because despite there being no money involved, you do pay for Islet. My brother goes into work every day for 12 hours. That was the amount agreed upon, so that he could still have time to keep the members of his family company. My parents found this out through a note that he left under their bedroom door. The person that lives with us now isn't my brother though. Not really. It acts like him. It thinks like him. But there is some core component missing. His soul, his consciousness, whatever you want to call it, is in the Islet system, not here. Apparently, while I was away, my brother had become very depressed. For the first time, I was learning about the girlfriend that had broken up with him. This was also the first time I heard about his struggles with school, and the kids there that were not just mean-spirited, but brutal. I was instinctively angry at Darren for telling me so little about his life. It was frustrating to know that I was out of town and absorbed in my own struggles while my brother was dealing with these things alone. So, Islet Services appealed to him. Islet representatives saw him struggling and scooped him up, 16 and vulnerable. He wrote in his note that this was a blessing. He might have done something much more drastic if he hadn't come across such an opportunity. Somehow, my mum bought into this idea. She seemed relieved that my brother was alive somewhere and supposedly much happier. My dad was much more upset, and so they argued for several weeks before his negative feelings towards the situation began to ease. As more and more people in the surrounding area heard about Islet, they joined the server. Advertisements were on the radio, on billboards, and even on the backs of bathroom stall doors. Bold, colourful letters would say things like, "Want to take a permanent vacation to a dream destination?" These vague offerings were enticing, and our neighbourhood quickly became one of empty shells. What was left of the bodies once their consciousness was transferred was completely functional. They operated just like the original person, only now they would work long hours for one of Islet's partner companies. Their minds worked, the metaphorical gears turning, but there wasn't anyone inside witnessing said cognition. I tried for a long time to get my brother back, calling representatives from the company and begging with them to let me speak to him. They insisted that this was not possible, and that their hands were tied when it came to releasing him from their server per my request, as he was apparently old enough to rightfully decide whether he wanted to stay or not. I was angry, not only at the company that preyed on my brother while he was in a vulnerable position, but also my parents, who coped with their loss by incorporating the non-sentient version of Darren into all of our family outings. They stopped talking about him as if he was somewhere else, and it wasn't uncommon for me to find myself looking at new Darren as if he was the same one I'd grown up with. I was horrified whenever this would happen. We continued on like this, my parents now in a perpetual state of delusion, and me distracting myself with a new job at a crummy diner, until the day Islet collapsed. We've received word that Islet servers have crashed. All information uploaded has been lost. All people lost. Islet has issued an apology and is aiming to work on the bugs in their program quickly in order to get it back up and running as soon as possible. For now, they will continue to make use of their patrons as is agreed upon in their contracts. The radio announcer delivered this message with a voice faltering slightly throughout. It was common knowledge that Melissa Bloom, one of the hosts of our local radio station, was a huge proponent of Islet and had made the switch herself months ago. She dawdled on, and her attempt to process the permanent deletion of her already absent soul struck me as utterly blasphemous. I was physically sick over it, over the knowledge that our area was now heavily populated with what were essentially animated carcasses, and over my brother being one of them. I vaguely remember throwing up at work after hearing the broadcast, and then heading home immediately afterward to be with my parents. On my way, I called my mom on the phone, and our conversation was little more than an outlet for us to cry together. I stepped out of my car once I got to the house, and she rushed out with open arms to meet me where I stood in the driveway. All I wanted was to be held by her, to be provided with the assurance that everything was and would be all right. That wasn't what I got when her arms wrapped around me in a hug that reminded me of a cheap harness on a sketchy roller coaster, so tight I could barely breathe, and yet, at the same time, not at all secure enough to convince me of my safety. None of the comfort I had always associated with my mother's embrace was present in this hug. It was wrong. She was wrong. The realization hit me with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. I was already feeling faint from when I emptied the contents of my stomach earlier. "When?" was all I could get out as I recoiled from her, my eyes beginning to blur with tears and my teeth gritted in anger. A few days ago," she responded solemnly, attempting to reach out and brush a section of hair behind my ear, with apology etched on her features. I slapped her hand away. "How could you?" I retorted. I felt betrayed. I was furious with her and with everyone else letting this happen. "Your brother, I couldn't. Your father and I, we couldn't take it." My father? Did that mean he was also? I couldn't bear to finish the thought. I was sinking. The asphalt of the driveway was enveloping my body, and my senses were being drowned out by its black viscosity. I fainted. I came to on our living room couch. My dad was the first one to see that I was awake. "Hey, how are you feeling?" he asked, my head throbbing. My throat was incredibly dry. "Fine," I muttered. What a wildly insufficient word to describe the way I was feeling. This wasn't my dad. The woman I could hear singing while she opened and shut cupboards and clinked dishes together in the other room wasn't my mom. The boy lounging in the chair next to me wasn't my brother. The ones I loved had all disappeared with Islet's server. I couldn't be certain that they were dead, but I didn't dare entertain the possibility that they were in some sort of limbo. If an afterlife existed, I wanted to imagine that there was a possibility we could go to the same one. They had to be dead. That was easier. We had dinner together that night, and I made sure to reach for all of the dishes myself, rather than asking for someone to pass them. I didn't want to experience the sensation of disgust that would overtake my body if I made accidental contact with any of them. The day had been traumatic enough, and all I wanted to do now was have a nice meal with my family. If we don't touch, I can pretend that nothing has changed. I can pretend that Islet never existed, and that it didn't leave me more alone than I ever imagined I would be. If you're listening to this, I'm probably dead or missing. You can't briefly describe the indescribable, so I've resolved to recount everything that happened to the three of us, exactly how it happened, to ensure that the truth remains out there one way or another, regardless of what happens to me. My name's Cole Gray. In October of 2018, my friends and I organised a hiking trip into the woods nearby for a few days over the school holidays, where we encountered something that is now permanently burned into my mind. My account begins early April, the middle of week 11. We were 16 at the time, and God, we hated school. Our peers were callous, imbecilic assholes. The teachers were overworked, and as a result, they were quick to anger and overly strict. The facilities couldn't have been updated in at least a decade. We were in English when I got a text from Alec reading, "It's on." We knew what he was on about. Alec came late that day, opened the door, trudged over to where we were sitting, and flopped into the chair like a corpse, the teacher giving him a death glare all the while. She yelled at him something about disrespect. I wasn't listening. I was more interested in what Alec had to say. Alec looked over at us with a grin on his face. They said we can do it. Alec's father was an outdoor enthusiast, an interest which Alec had inherited. He'd had the idea of us spending a few days by ourselves in the forest near Alec's house. It was a decent size, something like 200 square kilometers. There was even a lake that we planned to go fishing in. I'm not sure how Alec talked us into it. He was charismatic, I guess. A normal parent wouldn't have allowed that. But we lived in a small town, and ours worked a lot, hence our independence was encouraged from an early age, not to mention the fact that Alec was perfectly competent in everything we'd require. We all organised hiking bags. I packed a sleeping bag, a tent, lots of water, canned food, a portable stove, survival knife, compass, fishing rod, lighter. You get the picture. Our plan was to set off into the woods on the Friday and make our way about 15 kilometers in, although Alec's father did say not to go past the lake. I guess I need to explain why. On the outskirts of town, there was some sort of facility. There was only one dirt road going to and from it, cutting through the woods. It could be found about a kilometer north of the lake. Those who had braved the hike through the forest reported that it was sealed off from the outside world via an absurdly heavy-duty concrete wall surrounding the entire compound. It had to have been at least 4 or 5 meters tall, they would say. It was besmirched with graffiti from those with the adrenaline-fueled impulsiveness required to go looking for it. The top of the wall was heavily bestrewed with angled spikes and an overhanging tangle of razor-sharp barbed wire to ensure with absolute certainty that no prying eyes would peer upon the compound's contents. All of this earned the building the townspeople's nickname for it. Alcatraz's wall was absurdly overkill for the purpose of keeping people out. What the hell could they have possibly been keeping in there that warranted such a ludicrous aggregate of defense? It didn't occur to me at the time that it wasn't designed to keep us out. It was designed to keep something else out. It was a common occurrence to see trucks and black SUVs coming and going, definitely military and government. The SUVs were occupied by shady-looking men in black suits, the trucks with soldiers. The building was the obsession of those in the town interested in conspiracy theories. Their theories ranged from a containment facility for alien life to a research facility specializing in human mind control experiments. You understand what I'm getting at. Hearing all the theories fascinated me since I was young, but I never really believed in any of it. God, was I wrong. The sheriff did attempt to learn what was inside at the behest of some of the more neurotic townspeople, only to be forced to turn back at gunpoint. The town nutters had a damn field day with that. Since no one was allowed inside, there was no way to know for sure what the compound was being used for. The frighteningly plausible theories and general mystery surrounding the place, like a fine mist, proved to be enough motivation for people to steer clear of the place, for the most part. There were those few people reckless enough to go looking, 1 or 2 of whom didn't make it back. People didn't like to talk about that. Everything went smoothly for the first part of the afternoon. We had noticed some trucks speeding along the main road in the direction of Alcatraz. It was common to see that, but there were more than usual. That's weird, I remember thinking to myself. Alec elbowed me in the shoulder and chuckled. Maybe some of those aliens escaped from Alcatraz, eh, Cole? Ha, very funny. We settled on ditching school early, leaving at 3 and walking until it got dark, before setting up the tents. The forest was far more beautiful than I'd imagined in the weeks leading up to our expedition. The forest floor and trees were dense with the orange, yellows and browns of the autumn leaves. The trees stretched up so tall into the sky that the tops had reduced to being barely visible from our perspective. It was cloudy, the golden sunlight of the dim autumn afternoon bleeding through the cracks in the canopy high above our heads. The forest was alive with the calming sounds of birds chirping quietly around us, the chilly October wind sifting through the trees. All I can say is that it was truly an experience to behold. We found a good little clearing at about 7 that night. 4 hours of walking had taken its toll on my feet for sure. Alas, the work for the night wasn't yet complete. While Alex set up the tents, he had Dom and I take the saw and go scrounging for firewood. I had collected a decently sized bundle when my nose was accosted by the foulest thing I had ever smelt. The odour was unfamiliar, but I recognised it regardless as the reminiscent stench of death. I looked to my left and dropped the kindling I'd spent the last quarter hour collecting in sheer disgust and shock at the horrific scene before me. Damn. A deer, I think. It was hard to tell. The poor thing had been absolutely mauled, eviscerated beyond recognition. Its head was almost torn clean off, attached only by the sinews of the back of its neck. The ribcage had been torn apart, the entrails scattered all over the ground before it, some of it even splattered on the adjacent trees. I called Dom and Alec over, and upon seeing it, they both reared up and groaned in disgust. If anyone knew what was responsible for this act of animalistic savagery, it was Alec. I shot him a look. His face was painted with fear and confusion, not something I had seen before. Alec, any idea what could have done this? No bloody clue. This isn't like anything I've ever seen before. By the way he spoke to me, I could tell he was truthful in that he had no idea. A bear could have done this, but predators kill for food, and this thing hasn't been eaten, Dom chimed in. This is so messed up. I didn't get much sleep that night. I don't think the others did either. The morning was spent exploring, but everything looked the same, so we tried not to stray too far from camp. The lake had a jetty, so we went down and did some fishing. We didn't catch much. The day descended into night. It would have been a little bit past midnight. We were talking around the raging campfire when we heard it. Gunshots. Rapid. Probably from a rifle of some kind. 2 separate sets of shots. And then there was the screech. That damn screech. Shrill and piercing. No way it was natural at all. It couldn't have come from more than a few hundred meters into the forest. Dom interrupted the pursuant silence. Jesus Christ, what was that? I don't think we want to know. Most would have turned tail and bolted in the opposite direction. But we had alcohol-fueled courage on our side, and hence we decided to check it out. If only we had known just how bad the consequences of our stupid decision would be. We got our torches from our bags and trudged off into the darkness. After several minutes of looking, we came to where we thought the unholy screeching had come from. I strained my ears to listen. Nothing. Drip. I felt something warm on my shoulder. Drip. I used my fingers to wipe it off and placed them under the light of my torch. Blood. Still warm. I pointed my torch upwards and recoiled in horror, too shocked to scream. So did the others. It was a body, human, dressed in what looked like military clothing. It was impaled on a broken branch only meters above the ground, both of its arms gone. His throat had been torn out. There were deep lacerations all over his torso. Alec stared in shock, unable to rip his eyes away from the horror before us. Dom put his hands over his mouth and started quietly sobbing to himself. I rolled over and vomited all over the ground. As horrific as the mangled corpse was, I heard a sinister, growling noise about 50 meters ahead and looked up from the contents of my stomach to see something much, much worse. Hunched over, eating what could have only been another corpse, was something that will infest my nightmares until the day I die. It was skeletal, as gangly as a rake, twitching erratically. It had antlers on the top of its head that had no earthly right to be there, with skin as pale as the full moon. It was on all fours, with its arms and legs bent at horrifyingly unnatural angles. The others noticed it as well. I knew because Dom's quiet sobbing was quickly replaced by deathly silence. I spoke shakily. What in God's name is that? It realized we were there and bellowed out the same infernally shrill screech that we had heard before. I yelled out in apprehensive realization of what I had just brought upon myself. Damn! The thing closed the distance between us and it in seconds with sporadic, terrifyingly fast bursts, alternating between the ground and the trees. I stumbled back, tripped over a root, and within a blink of an eye, the ungodly creature was on top of me, pinning me down by my arms. I screamed in pain at its knife-like claws digging into my forearms. It was humanoid. Its piercing eyes were all-consumingly black, and its mouth was lined with crooked, freakishly long and horrifyingly sharp teeth. It opened its hideous mouth impossibly wide and shrieked deafeningly loud into my face. I swear I saw my life flash before my eyes as it was about to tear into me when it shrieked in pain again. Alec had stabbed it in the back with his knife before it turned from me, grabbed him, and sunk its teeth into his neck as he yelled out a blood-curdling scream that I can still feel resonating throughout my skull. "No!" I stumbled over to it, grabbing hold of the knife's hilt, and with all the panicked force I could gather, I wrenched it from the thing's back and stabbed it again as deep as I could, choking up the forest with its angry shrieks. It let go of Alec and stumbled to the side, but it was too late. My friend was dead. Dom and I looked at each other. I took one last look at my friend before we started in the opposite direction. I looked back and saw it pulling the knife out of its back, black with blood. I looked over at Dom. "Hide!" Hiding would typically be a bad decision, but there was no way in hell we could have outrun that thing. We both hid behind respective trees. I waited a few seconds and slowly looked back toward it on the left side of the tree. Nothing. I looked to the right and was forced to freeze before I had the chance to reinsert myself behind cover. It stood upright at well over 2 meters tall and within a meter of my face. It had to have seen me. Was it blind? It shrieked, listening intently as it took all of my willpower to stop myself from panicking. The night wind being the only thing to mask the sound of my shallow breathing. Dom and I locked eyes, and I mouthed a warning. "It's blind. Don't move." He nodded shakily in recognition. I don't know if what happened next was a sympathetic act of an otherwise cruel god or just a life-saving coincidence, but it started storming. Hard. The sound seemed to confuse and enrage it because it started to shriek and swing its claws around aimlessly. We took the chance and backed away, which turned into full-on running. This time I didn't look back as the hellish shrills faded into the distance. We ran until I tripped over. I must have hit my head on a rock or something like it, because I remember the feeling of blood trickling down my face while everything around me faded into blackness. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed. Dom had dragged me back to our camp and hidden me as best he could while he went to get help. We were both questioned by a couple of men in suits, except they weren't from the sheriff's department. They were the same men that we had seen in those black SUVs. They said only that they were from nearby. I couldn't help but wonder if they somehow had something to do with the thing in the forest. They claimed to have done a preliminary investigation, but I was shocked and angered to hear that they had declared it a bear attack. It was at this point that we both knew something was amiss. We tried looking into it, but the suits informed us that it was a closed case, implying that it wouldn't end well for us if we didn't leave it. I heeded the warning, but Dom didn't. No one's heard from him in days. I'm telling you this so that people will know the truth if I go missing. I don't care how many therapists they make me see, how many drugs they make me take. They can threaten me all they want. But I know the truth of what happened in the forest.